Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video we'll be covering another type of anemia known as pernicious anemia, or most commonly known as vitamin B12 deficient, alright? Vitamin B12 deficiency anemia. So, vitamin B12 deficiency, and we also have vitamin B9 or folic acid deficiency also, but it's mainly known as vitamin B12 deficiency anemia or pernicious anemia. Alright, so we'll be talking about the vitamin B12 part. So vitamin B12, not D, okay, vitamin B12 deficiency anemia. Alright, so let's go and get started. So we have a picture of the stomach here, right? So this is a basic picture, right, of a stomach. Alright, and over here we have our esophagus coming down, right? We have our esophagus. And then we know that, or we'll cover later, at least in our GI tract and all about the digestive system, as we'll have our first part of our small intestine here, our duodenum, and they'll keep on going, right? But our focus is the stomach here because we actually have on our stomach lining, right? We have many different types of cells, and I bet you've heard hydrochloric acid, right? This makes our stomach a very harsh environment. And so we have cells that line our stomach, all right, that produce this hydrochloric acid, and those cells are called parietal cells. All right, so these cells are called parietal cells. All right, and these parietal cells, they produce hydrochloric acid, right? But they also produce a factor, right, a protein called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor. All right, and intrinsic factor is the main component that plays a role in pernicious anemia. So intrinsic factor, what it does is that it gets secreted, right? So let's say we have intrinsic factor right here, right? We have intrinsic factor right here. I don't know why I drew it like that, but we have intrinsic factor right here, so let's go and label this as intrinsic. I don't like that, as intrinsic factor that's released by our parietal cells of our stomach lining. And let's say we eat, right? We eat something, and as we eat it, like let's say that one of the vitamins, right, that we've even stated here is vitamin B12. So let's say we have a lot of vitamin B12 here, right, in our stomach. And so most of the vitamin B12 actually has to bind to intrinsic factor. So regularly what would happen for someone without pernicious anemia, vitamin B12 would bind to the intrinsic factor, and the intrinsic factor is actually the main component that actually absorbs, or that helps absorb vitamin B12, right? So intrinsic factor actually brings the vitamin B12, you know what, let's just go and write it down all the way here, because we have much more room here. So it brings the vitamin B12, right? Brings the vitamin B12 into our first part of our GI tract, into our small intestine, and we absorb it into our bloodstream via our transcobalamin protein. All right, so then it's just a protein where vitamin B12 can actually get transported to by the intrinsic factor in the stomach. All right, so intrinsic factor, so you have to have intrinsic factor in order to absorb vitamin B12. All right, so because the vitamins that you eat from your let's say you just eat a vitamin rich some type of food, right? And that vitamin B12 comes in, usually it's actually bound to another protein, all right? Usually it's bound to another protein, all right? And so you need the HCl, which your stomach produces, right, regularly from your parietal cells also. You need this HCl to come here and cleave this area in which the protein is attached to the vitamin B12. So what this is going to lead to is that vitamin B12 is then going to be separated from this protein. All right, so this will lead to vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 separated from the specific protein that was bound to it. All right, And then this vitamin B12 has to bind to intrinsic factor, which is also produced by your parietal cells, in order to be absorbed. If there's no intrinsic factor, you're just going to poop it out, or you're going to poop the vitamin B12 out, right? So you need the intrinsic factor in order to absorb vitamin B12. Once you have the intrinsic factor, regularly what happens with a person without pernicious anemia is that the vitamin B12 binds to the intrinsic factor, then the vitamin B12 and the intrinsic factor, the intrinsic factor is responsible for, right, carrying this vitamin B12, and it actually goes to the ileum of the small intestine. So the ileum is actually the last part of the small intestine where most of the vitamin absorption into blood occurs. So then we're going to have vitamin B12 transported by intrinsic factor in the ileum, right? And once it reaches the ileum, it can get absorbed through the blood, where then vitamin B12 will go ahead and bind to a transcobalamin protein. All right, so it's going to bind to a transcobalamin protein, and then the vitamin B12 can actually go and take its effects, right? Because again, sorry about that, vitamin B12 is actually very important for your nerves, all right, for your nerves. And it's all your B vitamins, right? All your B complex vitamins are important in order to pretty much make ATP, right? Because remember, we saw in the transition phase, or I don't think we talked about it yet, but I will make a more detailed version of the transition phase of glycolysis. In the first enzyme complex, there's actually a protein or a pyrophosphate, right? A particular pyrophosphate called diamine pyrophosphate. And diamine pyrophosphate, right, so let's denote it as diamine pyrophosphate, THPP. Diamine pyrophosphate, notice the diamine in here, right? I mean, this isn't vitamin B12, but this is vitamin B1, right? But it said that most of the B complex vitamins actually help help make ATP at the end, all right? Because it's involved in the transition phase of glycolysis where you make acetylcoenzyme A, and then as we know, it goes and makes ATP in the electron transport chain, or with the help of our NADH and FADH2 electron carriers. But anyway, those are some of the main functions. And because we're talking about pernicious anemia, right, which is related to red blood cells and hemoglobin, we need B12 for our red blood cells to be healthy and to develop properly. So we need B12 for our red blood cells to develop properly. All right, so for our DNA to mature and for our DNA to condense, right? But because in pernicious anemia, people, so let's go and see what happens in pernicious anemia. So remember, regularly we have intrinsic factor, right? So in pernicious anemia, we see the main causes is either we don't produce, so not enough production of intrinsic factor, right, by our parietal cells of our stomach lining, or it can be autoimmune too, actually. So it can also be because of a autoimmune condition in which our B lymphocytes, right, creates antibodies. So our B lymphocytes can create antibodies to certain immunoglobulins, antibodies against the specific binding spot. So against the binding spot, right, or the active site, against the binding spot on the intrinsic factor. All right, so on the intrinsic factor. So what do I mean by that is that usually vitamin B12, see these binding spots right here? So antibodies can actually come here and released by the B lymphocytes, right? Or we can have an autoimmune condition where our B lymphocytes make antibodies against a specific binding spot or intrinsic factor, right? Which can actually come here, and let's say these are antibodies, right? We know it's not the shape, but these usually antibodies have a shape somewhat like this, where we have two binding spots. But just to fit this picture, right, the size, so let's say our antibodies look like this, and they can actually come and bind here. Now, if we have this competitive inhibition right here, right, it's kind of like competitive inhibition because it's binding straight up to the receptor wherever vitamin B12 binds. So what does that mean? Because our antibodies are now blocking off the binding sites of the intrinsic factor that was initially meant for vitamin B12, vitamin B12 can now not bind to intrinsic factor, which means vitamin B12 won't be absorbed into the blood and into the body. All right, so that's what can happen when we create antibodies because of an autoimmune condition. Now, if we don't produce enough intrinsic factor, that's straightforward, right? Because if we don't produce enough intrinsic factor, we can't absorb as much B12. All right, so that's what I want to get through, and for pernicious anemia, right? And so also, they found that pernicious anemia, because our DNA can't mature and can't actually condense properly, right? Because remember, we need B12 for our RBCs to develop properly, for our red blood cells to develop properly. They see that it actually leads to the red blood cells being macrocytic, all right? So it leads to the red blood cells being macrocytic. And so that means pernicious anemia is also a type of macrocytic anemia, which also means that our mean corpuscular volume, right, which pretty much helps us see the size of red blood cells, is going to be about greater than 95 femtoliters, all right, and that indicates that we have a larger than normal red blood cell size. All right, so that's pretty much it for pernicious anemia or vitamin B12 deficiency, and we also have some, this can be also related to some folic acid deficiency also, so vitamin B9, all right, but it's mostly related to vitamin B12, right, and it's also called pernicious anemia, so you'll see it both ways. All right, so that's pretty much it for this video. I really hope this video made sense to you guys, and I hope to see you guys in my future videos. We'll talk about more cool topics about chem, biochem, chem, and physics. All right, or sorry, chem, bio, and physics. And so see you guys later, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And so yeah, see you guys next time, and stay safe.